Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, everyone has been muted upon entry. Please be sure to stay on mute throughout the webinar to ensure we can hear each speaker. This meeting is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel within 1 week. We won't be taking any questions today, but feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and utilize it if you'd like to bring anything up, as we will be reviewing the chat after. There are ASL interpreters for your convenience available as well for this panel discussion. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our Executive Director here at the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, Kelly Owens.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thank you all for joining us here today for this important conversation. Here at OPDV, we're going to spend the next year really starting conversations and having rough conversations and tough conversations and the conversations that we need to have. So today we're going to talk about masculinity and consent and how we can talk about stopping rape culture on college campuses with this great panel of men that have joined us here today. Let me tell you a little bit about the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. For those of you who don't know, we are the only state level executive agency at a cabinet level in the country that deals with the issue of domestic violence and gender-based violence. So we're really proud here in the state of New York to have an agency dedicated to that issue. Our mission here is at OPDV is to end domestic, sexual, and all forms of gender-based violence. So we got a big job in front of us, and we're going to dig deep a little bit today. So, you know, in order to have to really end gender-based violence and domestic and sexual violence, we have to have really tough conversations, and those conversations have to happen with everyone. You know, often we have to really dig deep into society and people's lived experiences to understand violence, and especially intimate partner violence. So often we leave men out of this conversation and we exclude their voices in the conversation and often dismiss them out of the room. We're not going to do that. Today we're bringing men into the conversation, and we're bringing men into the conversation who aren't afraid, intimidated, and don't want to be dismissed from the room when we talk about these issues. We want to make sure that men are part of this movement, and when we address the issues of masculinity and consent, there's no better people to talk to about that. This panel is the first event in our campaign engaging men and boys and asking folks to start the conversation. So this is kind of our first kickoff event, and we're glad that you've all joined us. The panel participants have participated in the conversations about consent in their work, and they're vital to making sure that we get to the conversations to prevent and end gender-based violence. We're grateful for the following panelists who have joined us here today, and I'm going to give them all about 90 seconds to introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Eric.
Hey y'all, my name is Eric McGriff, he, him pronouns, and I'm the prevention coordinator at the Crime Victims Treatment Center. I've been in the work since high school. I'm from Syracuse, New York, so I've been working with Vera House, where I was co-chair with my twin brother for an Engaging Men campaign called the White Ribbon Campaign. What's good, Nathan? I see you too. After working at Vera House, I went to Syracuse, still worked at Vera House after I left Syracuse, still working at Vera House with George in the Engaging Men and Boys program and in their alternatives program for working with men who batter. And then I moved down here to the New York City area, where I am building the prevention program at the Crime Victims Treatment Center and doing a lot of work to still try and center Engaging Men and Boys work. So thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you, Eric. Go Orange. And George. George is one of my favorite people. So George, please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for being a part of this conversation. George Kilpatrick, he, him, pronouns, co-director for prevention education here at Vera House in Syracuse. Vera House comprehensively provides counseling, advocacy, shelter, and education, and other supports for victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, elder abuse, and other forms of abuse. And my work specifically has been with engaging men over the last 10 years, engaging them through our 12 Men model. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but also through some other programs, Men of Strength Club, Coaching Boys into Men, Mentors in Violence Prevention, to really get young men and adult men in conversation about the ways that we can prevent gender-based violence. And one of the things I will say is that in that work, we have seen change happen in the room. So I'm looking forward to a real good conversation with our group today.
Kelly, I'm just going to interrupt real quickly. The interpreters are asking that the presenters slow down a little bit. So this is just a friendly reminder. Thank you all.
And I will slow down.
Me too, George. I talk really fast. So we're going to throw it to Jim. Jim will slow down and he'll talk slower for everybody so that the interpreters can understand it. So I had the pleasure before I came to OPDV to hear Jim speak here in New York about 4 years ago, and was moved by his presentation, and he's been an asset for us here at OPDV since then, and before then, probably before I got here. But Jim, please go ahead and introduce yourself. Jim, you're muted.
See, you missed all of the golden things I
Yes,
said.
yes, you got to start all over.
No, thank you so much, Kelly. And I have to say what an honor it is to be on such an amazing panel with people like George and Eric and amazing work that you guys are doing. My name is James Henderson. I come to this work from growing up in a home where there was family violence, where my stepfather was horribly abusive in a time when we did not hold men accountable. And what the system did to my mother and us children was actually far more harmful, and trained us not to participate in a system, and really emboldened my stepfather, where he got to do stuff from really well-meaning people with well-meaning policies. They just had devastating effects on victims and children. And so I really kind of committed my work to saying, how do we engage men and hold men accountable for their choices? And how are we always mindful of every policy and procedure? How does that reflect back on the victim and the children? Because there's collateral consequences to everything we do to the men that we're working with. And so I always have to be very mindful. It's not just about accountability. It's really about creating safety and autonomy and agency with the people who are being victimized, rather that be the identified victim, the children, or the community, right? I was lucky that I got to work as a probation officer in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with an amazing judge, a great shelter and victim service organization, and prosecutor, and just an amazing team. And then I run a batterers intervention program in Wayne County, where 60% of my clients are actually from child custody cases. They've never been charged, maybe never had order of protection. Not all people feel safe using the criminal justice system. So how do we find justice for people who fall outside that sphere that we've all focused on, right? And how do we work with those men? And how do we get buy-in from those men to work on themselves when we don't have the coercive power of the courts, right? So I'm really honored to be here and feel blessed. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all. So we're going to jump right into it. And we're going to, I'm going to start my first question with George, but please, everybody feel like you can jump into the conversation. We want it to be really conversational. So if you have something you want to say, please make sure you say it. George, when it comes to messages, what messages do boys get about masculinity, sex, consent? And what roles do the media play and society play in those kind of messages? I know you all want to talk about this, so please, when George is done, jump in.
I was going to say, I'm just making sure I'm not muted so I can answer that question. Well, look, the message that we grow up with is that we're entitled to sex, for example, by any means necessary. And so we're going to use whatever tactics that are available to us. And we see this playing out on college campuses and throughout the community, no matter what age you are, that, messages around you throw like a girl, or you're not as good as if you do it like a girl, or man up, or things of that nature. These are the messages that you receive growing up. And so you're pressured then to begin to perform based on those messages. This is how I'm supposed to act. I'm not supposed to show feelings. I'm not supposed to show emotion other than anger. I'm supposed to be in control of the situation at all times. I have to be I'm told that I'm the man of the house, and that comes with a certain expectation. Those are the messages that we receive. And when we talk about consent, well, again, going back to what I said earlier, by any means necessary. So while we talk about no means no, and it should mean no, and yes means yes, we know that that's not what we hear, and that's not what often young men believe they're supposed to do. And the other issue with that is you also have a peer system, right? Of people that are sort of egging guys on to do things that they know probably isn't right for themselves, but they end up doing that anyway. And so you see this reinforced in media, especially around masculinity. One of my favorite shows of all time was The Honeymooners, right? But what was the famous line in The Honeymooners, right? Pow, right in the kisser, or to the moon, Alice, if you don't stay in your place, right? And I'm growing up as a kid laughing until I got into the work of preventing gender-based violence. And now I know that that's problematic. But think about it. I laughed. It was one of my favorite shows growing up. I'm of that generation. So think about all the generations of men where that sort of behavior was normalized. The media does play a role in some of that. And again, we see that sort of behavior carried out even with young men, because this is what they're taught generationally. And programs like ours, conversations like this, will help us to unlearn some of those toxic messages so that we can have a more aspirational way of thinking about masculinity.
Thanks. Jim or Eric, do you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think George hit on a lot of great points. I think of the MVP curriculum, where we talk about major contributing factors and those attitudes and beliefs that really are really strong connectors to behaviors that we don't like to see. The rigid gender roles, the idea that violence solves problems, one person should be in control of a relationship, a right to sex. The media does a really good job at facilitating and fostering those beliefs in men and boys across the country. And it really teaches us a limited view of what it means to be a man, though it is changing. You know, I have had sixth graders in Syracuse and in New York City that are non-binary, pansexual, outlet like identifying. So I'm like, teach me something. But, you know, a lot of those pieces of dominant masculinity, the dominant story, are still very much a part of our culture. And it's one that hypersexualizes Black men and makes them the perpetrators, even though when it comes to a lot of these sex crimes, folks generally do it within their race, and the people who do it outside of their race the most are white men. Hello, slavery. It's one where men aren't seen as victims, that really reinforces the entitlement, and it hates on men who don't fit this very small box, the man box of what we want a man to be. And there are consequences for men when you don't fit in those boxes. And so media, while it doesn't cause violence, it really does create a space where there's a lot of social pressure, and that's important for us as social creatures. We are hardwired for connection, right? It's the feel-good hormones that we get and a hug that form the foundations of kiss and make it feel better, right? Biologically, evolutionarily, we need our social connections to survive because we can't survive on our own. So that is really a part of us biologically. And the other side to that is we are averse to social pain in many of the same ways that we are averse to physical pain. And when it comes to the social pains that we experience, a lot of those impacts.
Eric, you went on mute, I think.
No,
I hear him.
Oh. And when it comes to those social pains, the impacts in the brain often last longer. They are very, very big motivators. So media putting up and glorifying this idea of what a man is, this very limited view, it sort of sets us up, and we all want to be cool. We all want to be accepted. And you know what? For me, as a queer, half Black man, I understand how hard it is with the messages that masculinity teaches. That's why I stayed in the closet for so long. I also know that just because other men are straight, it doesn't mean that they don't have those same things happening to them too. And that's why, for me personally, I know that I'm in a better place. I'm in a good place to hold compassion for a lot of men in these conversations, because I can take on that labor, because I can identify with it, and I can have compassion for them when maybe, you know, a survivor doesn't have that space, or a woman doesn't have that space, or a queer person doesn't have that space. But media literacy and better, more diverse representation in media could do wonders for us.
You're muted, Kelly.
Yeah, sorry, Jim. I know you want to jump in, but I also, can you kind of lead us into the conversation as you go about how these messages contribute to gender-based violence in DV and SA?
Well, you know, when I was thinking, when they were talking, and I thought about, okay, social media and all this stuff, I think media is so much bigger than just music and movies and television, but even the messages we get from our faith community, right? Who should be in charge, who should submit. And I can use scripture as a way to justify my behavior, to coerce my partner into doing or submitting to my desire. And so it really, we're looking at this whole concept of entitlement, right? So we talk about male privilege, we talk about white privilege, we talk about, and men think money equals power, right? So all these things, you should submit to my desires, you should be appreciative for everything that I do for you. And if you're not, you're somehow less deserving, and I don't owe you any type of respect. And I even feel I have a right to dominate and control you. Look at the whole concept of makeup sex, right? For men, we think if I can get you to have sex with me, all's forgiven, right? I was abusive to you earlier. I degraded you. I humiliated you. Maybe I've cheated on you and you're mad at me. So instead of me taking any ownership for my behavior, if I can coerce you into having a sexual encounter with me, somehow I'm absolved of all responsibility. And the men really don't see that as I was sexually abusive. I said, no, she forgave me. We even had sex together. We even did this. When we talk about consent, did the person even have the ability to consent, right? Did I have a right to even ask for that behavior after my own behavior? Had I taken any type of accountability or responsibility? And so I think that's our challenge sometimes, is getting men just to acknowledge the harm that my behavior has done, and how my partner may not even be in a space where they can truly make an honest consent. Because what would happen if she said no? What would happen if she resisted me? And so these men don't see that way. Unless I tied you up, or I restrained you, or I did this, it's not rape. Instead of, no, if she didn't have a right, or you forced your will on her, or she wasn't comfortable, this is how we have to kind of help men start to examine and look at that, I think.
Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about your work with college students and the intersection of masculinity and consent, since Jim kind of laid it out a little bit too, on college campuses and how it's playing out?
Yes, and thank you for the most recent comment, because that's where I was going to go. I mean, when you go to college, you have a bunch of folks, a lot of whom probably have not had comprehensive sexuality education. And then they're going into these situations where there's a lot of unsupervised space, where there is partying and alcohol, and they're trying to navigate a lot of these boundaries that they haven't been taught exist, so they don't know how to maintain or to look out for. And then you have like all these social dynamics, right? You go to like a college campus and you have fraternities and sports clubs hosting a lot of these parties, because another gender-based piece to this is that a lot of sororities aren't allowed to have parties. You have to go to a fraternity if you want to have a party. And in a fraternity, it's usually half the size of the sorority. And I can't help but think that that's for a reason. It makes it a lot easier for the men in these groups to do what they do. Even in sports clubs, they make sure that there's like a good gender ratio. And one of the ways they'll do it is by charging the boys at the door, not the girls. And so I think on college campuses, it's just like a hot spot for a lot of this stuff to happen, because of conversations that should have been had that aren't being had. And sometimes it's just like a check mark. You go through orientation, you do your sexual harassment training, and then it doesn't come up for you again. A lot of times I talk with these fraternities and sororities, and I'll talk to them about safeguards they can put up. We can put up mandatory training. We can incentivize this kind of work. We can say you have to do some kind of like bystander training or something before you have these parties in these spaces where you're going to have to be a bystander, but they're not happening. And I don't see this comprehensive approach happening a lot. And it's not always that folks don't care. Like, college campuses are busy, especially now. And the people that I'm engaging with often have multiple hats that they're wearing. They're a Title IX coordinator, a counselor, and they're our housing director, right? So it's super, super hard, but that's why I think it's so important to have folks like us. It was so important for me being in college, having Vera House in the community that I had a connection with since high school, and being able to bring them in to give us free training, to help us, to add to our school budgets for events if we wanted to collab on something, to help share their ideas and always be a resource for us. But yeah, college campus, there's a lot going on there, and we need a lot of help in these spaces.
And Kelly, can I just add, like, for example, we have support on Syracuse University's campus and 9 other schools in our region to provide that direct advocacy and support, and including education about gender-based violence, of course, in the Title IX. And there was a study, I don't know if you all saw the study about 1 in 3 college men, right, that said that they would, quote, rape someone if they could get away with. But what they ended up saying is that, well, they didn't really use the language rape, because if they actually used that word, then the percentage would have been lower. But what they said was, if they could have sex with a woman by force, then 1 in 3 said that they would. So that's the sort of problem that we're dealing with in our campuses today. This lack of awareness, but this idea that, well, I don't want to call it rape because then I'll be bad, but I will force somebody, not knowing the difference. And I think that goes back to this idea of lack of awareness, lack of education, but also messages that we receive as men, male identified individuals, about what we're entitled to. And that's, we're still having to unlearn that.
It's interesting that you say that, George, because in our batterers intervention program, obviously, we've all probably seen the power and control wheel, and our men can identify even where they've used privilege, and I've used emotional abuse, and I've used isolation. When they get to sexual abuse, they go, I've never done that. I've never done that. I'll be honest, I don't know, right? And then we look at, well, let's define what sexual abuse does. Have you compared your partner to other person? Have you put her down? Have you cheated on your partner? We start looking at all the ways that we sexually abuse people, that we sexually disrespect people. And then all of us have done that, right? At some point in our lives, we have done these types of things, and we don't want to put ownership to it. It's the same thing when we talk about strangulation. My men will never say they strangled someone. They might say they choked somebody, right? Because that word is just far more palatable for them. So to really be able to label something and say, no, this is a form of sexual abuse. This is a form of forcing your will on another person, or using, to make the person feel less than. I think it's in having that conversation, which we don't want to talk about. Men, we just want to be in control, have the answers, and have everything right, and not have these deep conversations a lot of times.
So I'm going to jump off script a little bit because that's what I do. But the issue of comprehensive sex ed here in New York has been debated for a very, very long time, or actually not even debated for a very, very long time. Prior to coming here, I was an advocate for Planned Parenthood, and it was one of our major tenets to really get comprehensive sex ed into mandated in New York State schools. New York City, they have it, but it's not throughout the whole state. And I think one of the things that we struggle with is the education piece around that and what that means, because when you start to talk about comprehensive sex ed, everybody gets all worked up. So, from the perspective of where you guys sit, what are some messages that you think we all could be using to really educate people more around what early, like preschool to on in life, how do we start to make people feel comfortable with this conversation? Because clearly we need to have it, and we need to have it about consent. We need to have it about bodily autonomy, all of those things. But, even in New York, it's a sticky subject. So thoughts?
I can jump in because in addition to doing the men and boys program, I also did some elementary stuff at Vera House. And so, I get this a lot because people are like consent in second grade. Oh my gosh, what are you talking about? And I'll tell them, hey, it can be as simple as drawing a stick figure, having circles that get bigger around them, and saying, who can go here? Who can go here? Who can get this close and no, you can't pick your pet? It can start out with a conversation like I do with my fifth and sixth graders now here in Brooklyn. I will give everyone an index card on the first day and ask questions about boundaries. Ask them what they like so I can incorporate it in my material, but I'll also ask them, can you name some teachers who you trust so I know who to go to when we start having these deeper conversations. They're interactive and ways that you can gamify this conversation as well. And it's so important because I'll say, like, for me personally, in that video that George shared that my brother and I did to be a man, one of the things I said in there is about learning that gay is an insult. I knew that I couldn't come out. I felt like I wouldn't be supported in third grade just because I was sitting in class and I watched boys say gay, laugh, and my teacher did nothing. Absolutely nothing. I don't think he was a bad teacher. I don't think like he was homophobic or anything, but him not doing anything, not saying anything, and it never being a part of the conversation, that let me know for the rest of my schooling, K through 12, I am not safe here. And it's not going to be okay for me to come out because they won't even do anything here. So how are they going to do something when it escalates further? Right. And it got even worse because I'm thinking I stand out here in Syracuse, New York, where I am half black, half white. Right. There's already a racial dynamic when it comes to my sexuality. I already had to hide relationships because when parents found out I'm half black, they didn't want me near their daughters. Like it was a big thing. So having this comprehensive sexuality education, it's helpful. It reduces liability, but we've also seen it in other places, like the Netherlands, where they have it real young. And, folks start having sex at the same age, but they regret it less because they do it in a more informed way. There's less teenage pregnancy. There are less, sexual violence acts coming because we've talked with kids about navigating these conversations. So it's super, super important to have conversations about comprehensive sexuality so that we can set the boundaries that we need to when we go to places like college.
And the program that he's talking about is called Youth Education Program. We do a component for second grade, we do a component for fourth grade, and then we have a middle school and a high school curriculum. And it's all age appropriate so that as Eric described, when you have a stick figure, how close, good touch, bad touch, signs, of relationships and what you can do, what's appropriate for you, and having discussions about that. So there's a way to do it in concert, and the schools all agree to do it, and even in some of the parochial schools, although there's a little bit of a different kind of a dialogue there, but still, it is possible to educate youth in our community so that they have the information that they need.
I think our culture, for Americans, we like to have possession of things. We like to conquer things, right? We like to own things. It's my daughter, it's my son, it's my girlfriend, it's my wife. And so it all kind of has this position that I control you. And so for me, in working with fathers and men, it's getting them to just identify, how do I teach my children agency? And we try to talk about, you should always ask permission to touch your own child. Like, is it okay if I hug you, honey? Is it okay if I touch you? What if your daughter doesn't want to hug grandma? Many times we make them, no, you get over there and hug your grandma. Well, shouldn't you teach your daughter or your son, it's okay. If you don't want to hug grandma, you don't have to hug grandma, right? And we can start that at a really young age, and people don't realize what we teach kids is that you have to submit and you have to obey and you have to allow this to happen. And I think that goes on throughout life. So I know it's not college campus I'm talking about, but I think when we're working with men who've used violence or men who are controlling, to really have them think about what agency over one's body means and how have I played that in my life, and have I been respectful and looked at that, and would I have responded differently had I have been taught and raised in that way.
Yeah, Jim, that's really interesting because that's, as a kid, I can remember being told to hug my relatives when I didn't want to, and was almost shamed into not, if I didn't want to I didn't want to hug Uncle Charlie, I wasn't being a good girl.
That's
And, I can remember feeling so uncomfortable with that. And, we do that all the time. We do that all the time. So,
And so now you're not a good girlfriend. You're still not a good girl. Could we get these shadow messages, right? Like we talk about core beliefs. If you're talking cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're in a Jungian therapy, you might talk about a shadow message. But these underlying self-conscious memories that says, this is what it is to be valued and important, and this is what I'm supposed to do. And then now that plays out in my adult life too, even though it was implanted in me at age 3 or 4.
yeah. So, talk to us about all of you, the tools that you use in your work to address these issues. We'll start with George. I'm always impressed with, George came and talked to us. I've talked to George a number of times about some of the tools he's using to help, change behavior and actually hearts and minds. So we'll start with you, George, and then please, everybody else feel like they can jump in.
And thank you, Kelly. And certainly Eric has been involved in this work. It's called our 12-Men model. That is a signature program that was created by Vera House about 12 years ago, pulling together tools from various different programs. The core mission of that program is to engage men in conversation to help them to unlearn some of the things that they grow up with, that's part of a culture that contributes to violence and abuse. And so we get men, we ask somebody to get 11 other men that they know that's in their circle. And then we ask them to commit to being together for 5 sessions, 2-hour sessions each, talking about healthy masculinity, talking about domestic violence, talking about sexual violence, and talking about putting it all together so that they can begin to see how they can have an impact on changing the dynamics of relationship and intimate partner violence and abuse. For example, the core of it is, how do we interrupt and stop things that are happening with the people that we know? Bystander intervention, bystander behavior, so that it's not somebody over there, it's us holding each other accountability. We ask the men to name the times in their life when they have caused harm and abuse. And that usually is a pretty big eye opener, not only for us, but as the group, for the group. The other thing that we do in those sessions is we, as facilitators, we name our stuff. I would say another word, but we're on a nice family call. But we name our stuff too. In other words, when we're in facilitation in these conversations, we become part of the community. And so whether it's college presidents, whether it's the mayor of Syracuse, whether it's the community-based person at a local church, it doesn't matter. We're getting all of these men together to make sure that we can have these conversations. And what they tell us is this, that they don't have these conversations, that once we get them in the room, and how do we get them in the room? Well, we don't say, let's come talk about domestic violence. We invite them to have a leadership conversation in many ways. And then once they get into the room, they start to unpack and unpeel. And then we also find out that some of them have experienced domestic violence and sexual assault as a kid. They find the space and the courage, if you will, to name that in their own lives. But we're also finding that it works, right? Cornell University recently did a study of our program that the guys who go through it feel more confident in interrupting sexist behaviors. They feel more confident in speaking up in situations where they may not have felt confident before. And they're willing to get in touch with their own vulnerability and be vulnerable with each other. We really like this idea. I've been through hundreds of conversations. Eric has been through some of them as well. Many, not hundreds, but many. And we know that something happens in the room. It's different from working with people who have caused harm, but who knows in the room who hasn't caused harm, right? The other thing that we've done, just to bring another space into this, we just created a space for men who are queer identified. And this was the first time we ever did that. And the relation that, listen, masculinity and the performance of masculinity shows up in those spaces as well. And the other thing we learned in the queer identified space is that there weren't really healthy examples for them either. So how then how can we expect even in same gender relationships to have healthy relationships if there weren't examples? Now that's one sample. We hope to run the program many more times, but one of the reason why we did that is because we recognized that our 12-man model space was heteronormative and it didn't have a space for queer identified men to talk and share their truth. And so whether it's on a college campus where we've held these, whether it's in a community-based organization, it's about getting men in the room to have a conversation. And we know that the conversation impacts them and changes their dynamic. And you're almost compelled to do something if you see something, right? It's like, I don't know about you all who are on this call, but I know that if I see something, my antenna goes up and I'm like, okay, what do I do? How do I do it? Do I do it this way? Do I do it that way? We give them tools on how to react also that keeps them safe, but also causes them to act. And I think I went over my time, but I was trying to give you all of the ways in which we work with them. But the recruitment comes from the individual. So it would be like this. I would go to James, give me a group. Let's have a group and let's have a conversation so that the people who are impacted are the people that you hang with and that you know.
Jim, do you want to talk about some of your work and the tools?
You know, what I liked about what he was saying too is it can't be we versus them, right? We're all part of this culture. We've all engaged in this behavior, and it's very shaming and hard for people to own their stuff. And if we can own our stuff first and give concrete examples and talk from our own lives, that's better. Really, our society, we've raised men to be controlling, domineering, and abusive, and then we punish them for doing what we train them to do. And so to help men realize that and look at that, I think is so important. I think the other thing that George is kind of talking about, when we look at changing our behavior, we actually do role playing with these guys, right? Because they can say things and they have some of the intelligence up here in the prefrontal cortex, but when push comes to shove, we go into what's comfortable or some of that underlying programming. So, but being able to, again, go back and examine what are my core beliefs? What are those shadow messages that give me this sense of entitlement, this sense of privilege, this need to be in control? And then how do I ground myself so I can use that thinking part of my brain and not move back to that reptilian part, right? Where that fight, flight, or freeze is so important. And a lot of our men don't know how to do that. We're not trained that. When I misbehaved or was full of emotions as a kid, what happened? I was spanked, thrown in my room and told to suck it up. Be a big boy, don't cry. No one taught me how do I deal with those emotions, right? What do I do with rejection? What do I do with hurt? You know what I do? I stuff it and then I'm allowed to blow up because boys will be boys, right? I'm allowed to, the biggest man win. So dad got to win when I was little. Now guess what? I'm the big guy. So I get to win and I get to enforce my will. So really having those types of discussions and how, you know, teaching men, I think, how to de-escalate and deal with their emotions and talk about those honestly, how to look at our own entitlement and privilege. And then how do I role play situations where maybe I feel I've been wronged or things aren't going right? And how do I handle that in an accountable way? I think the hard thing for us too is teaching men how to hold other men accountable. We don't know how to do that, right? Sometimes we just think it's not my business, right? Keep your mouth shut. And we say, well, you know, so how we role play holding each other accountable. How do you check people? One of our first assignments, I don't want to spend too much time, but we have to pick out 5 people in our lives who care and love us and support us. And then we have to talk about how would they check us. And then we write a script on how they could help hold us accountable. What types of things we might need to might need to hear or be reminded. Because sometimes we don't always lean on the people who could give us the best feedback. We hang out with a totally different group of people.
Eric, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, George really got most of it because obviously I grew up working with George's program. But I would say, like, use a strengths-based approach that we talk about a lot in our trauma work. Look at what's going on in your community because you'll find, like I did, there are a lot of organizations that do this work, that'll do it for free, that'll give you access to resources. Like growing up in this work, through Beer House, I was able to get, trained in coaching boys and the men, the 12-man model, the Men of Strength model. At Syracuse, I was able to get MVP trained. And then at Beer House, they brought Jackson Cats back so I could get trained again for a 2-day event using EIE funds, right? So there are things in your community that you can look for, even if it's not a community-based organization. Do you have an LGBTQ center, a women's center, an advocacy center? Do you have coaches who are on your team who can mandate certain curricular training for their folks? Do you have the support of student activities where an event like Take Back the Night can be a part of accreditation for fraternities and sororities? So they have to send like 20% of their membership so they get that credit. There are a lot of things that you can do if you look through your community and you strategize with the people who are already there so that you can build your internal capacity, in addition to the Jackson Cats, the Don McPhersons, the movies like The Mask You Live In. Collaborate with them, right? That's how you can take a step in being seen more as a co-conspirator and less as like these men who are just jumping in here and we don't know what you're doing. So we might sort of be suspicious of your intentions for a lot of different reasons, because, you know, in this work, when I hear about men's groups, a lot of it is like, are you man-hating? Are you doing this without the supervision or support of women and queer people? So you're just going rogue, right? So collaborating and working with the folks that you have near you is a great way to also, you know, better start a partnership and ally, accomplice, co-conspirator work with your own communities.
Eric, that's a great point, and I want to come back to it. I think George wants to make a point too.
I just want to make one other point about the work we do with those men. We did recently create what we call the buddy system. And so after each session, we have assigned another male identified individual in the group to keep tabs on one another and to process and discuss the ways in which we can keep this work going forward. So not only are they doing that work in the session, but they're doing this work after the session so that they have a resource. Because one of the things that we want to build, we haven't been able to give men the tools. Eric talks about a strengths-based approach, whether it's on campus or whether it's in the community. What are the tools that they need and what's the support that they need? And so if I'm about to do something that I'm questioning, I should be able to pick up the phone and call my buddy who might be able to support me and get me through that situation. And I mean, look, I'm grown, but I still have friends that I call if I'm having, you know, I need the process. And I think we have to get male identified individuals in particular used to calling to process. And so this buddy system helps them to be reinforced in the work that we're trying to do to end gender-based violence, whether it's in the community or whether it's on campus.
Great. So to jump back to accountability, you know, within the domestic violence movement, it still is kind of controversial to talk about how do we hold people accountable, and you know, the model around criminal justice accountability and then community accountability. Can you guys talk a little bit with us about, you know, your work in that and the transformative work that you've seen, and address a little bit about the hesitation around accountability programs, resources, and all of those things? Because, you know, in New York, we continue to struggle with what accountability should look like. So Jim, why don't we start with you?
It's kind of interesting. I think when we started looking at batterers intervention in the beginning, it was a little bit heavier handed accountability, right? You are just trying to get men to acknowledge that we were responsible for our choice to use violence was a big step, right? Because for so long, it was so entitled and so accepted that we had to move that way. I think now the language is becoming a little bit softer. And they've moved away from, we used to, for a minute, we were demonizing batterers, right? And men who have used violence. And they're just all bad. And this is more about punishment. And now it's looking at, you know, a lot of these men also went through their own histories of trauma, experienced their own abuse. You would not believe the amount of men that I have who've been sexually abused and been mistreated or physically abused going home. And they're just passing that trauma on to the next generation, right? I'm going to give it to my partner, to my children, and then they're going to give it onto theirs, and trying to figure out how do we respect their trauma, but yet hold them accountable for the trauma they're passing on. Because I'm 100% responsible for the choices that I do and the harm that I do. And I think we're trying to also address domestic violence and sexual assault and broader than just outside of intervention programs. If that's the only place I'm hearing this is wrong, that's problematic, right? I didn't quit smoking because the Surgeon General put a tab on the side of the cigarettes, right? It was seeing commercials. It was having people not let me smoke at airports, not let me smoke at bars, not let me smoke at restaurants. My mother harping me about my health. My girlfriend saying, you know, your breath smells, right? All this outside pressure finally said, okay, maybe I really need to change my behavior. And so we could do a better job at that. I know when I was in high school, we had a class called Literature Social Problems. It was a literature class, but they didn't deal with domestic violence because that didn't exist in the textbooks then. But, you know, we looked at child abuse, alcoholism, divorce, all this stuff. And I think having classes building in these conversations in regular literature classes, building it into, you know, into our schools where we're not just talking about it in these specialized little programs and groups will help send a much stronger message too. When we do look at the behavior that our men did, we try to look at how do I make restitution for my behavior beyond just the criminal justice sense, right? Instead of that, you know, how do I truly make amends to the person that I harmed, to the community, and what types of things I need to do. And men don't really think about that. We think, okay, I ripped your blouse during this assault. I got to pay for your blouse. Well, what else did I do? How did that harm your children? How do I make amends to them through my actions? You know, how did it affect your family? How do I make my amends there? Like, what does real restitution look like? And how does Jim atone for his choices? And he's done. I want, when I get arrested, I know not everybody's pro arrest. I think growing up, if I would have seen my father arrested, it would have sent me a message that what he did was wrong, that somebody thought he did was wrong. Instead of them telling my mom to take a walk and calm down and my mom's wrong, instead of my mom having to go to a parenting class and my mom have to go to the shelter and us having to go to therapy and us having to take, you know, everything seemed to be about us, and it was services, well-meaning services, but still the message was something's wrong with mom and something's wrong with us. Instead of no, his behavior needs to be addressed. And even if my mom wouldn't have prosecuted and the case would have disappeared, at least somebody sent me a message that was wrong. And so when judges, I'm working with judges, I'm like, we have to always relate this back. Here's what happens. I put you in jail, not because you assaulted Mary. I put you in jail because you didn't comply with my order. You didn't go to the class. You didn't show up to probation. So really, again, we lose the message that no, this is really about making your partner safer. This is about making our community safer, not about you obeying a judge, you obeying a probation officer, you jumping through the hoops. So we got a lot of work to do in our criminal justice system, and it can't be our only solution. And New York's actually doing better than anyone else and trying to look at how family court can look at this, how can volunteers come into programs, how do we engage people out there? And I think you guys are really leading the forefront on that, at least in Manhattan they are.
Eric, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to accountability, this is a big issue, right? It's you know, it's bigger than any of us in any one case because of things like the criminal justice system and the way that that replicates harm and doesn't help prevent or change behaviors afterwards. Is it, when we talk about accountability, is this training going to be a check mark after an hour conversation about manhood and causing harm, or are we serious? I also think, like, what does the survivor want? You know, when folks down here find out that I have a history of working with men who batter, one of the things I hear is that, well, one of the biggest things the Title IX coordinator says, oh my gosh, the survivor doesn't want him to get expelled or suspended. They want him to take like a 5-hour course, right? Put in that time so they know what they did was wrong. And, you know, because they've seen me present through my training at Beer House, they're confident that we can usually get through to people because we do this work and they've seen what it looks like and they see that we really are trying to be the accomplices that follow their lead and just translate it in a way where, you know, a lot of men, they won't hear stuff from women, a lot of these men who do this work, or they'll posture in a certain way if a woman is in there in a way that they don't when they're going to be in an all men's group. So I think accountability, like it's best for us in the victim services world to have options, just like we do for survivors, because we know not all victims want the same thing to happen, right? So that's super important. I'll say another piece to this is, for me, I've been most successful doing this work in men-only groups. And like I said before, once you say men-only groups, you're going to get some side eye. So you just have to be willing to explain why you have that men's-only group. And for me, it's as easy as saying, hey, there's a reason why we have affinity groups. Affinity group 101 is that when you're in a group with people who do the same thing as you or identify similarly, it creates a certain level of safety so that you can talk more openly about things you wouldn't otherwise. Right? So affinity groups, like a men's group, are a great place for us to create a container as long as you're guided and supported and following the women's centers, the queer centers, the advocacy centers. And not just following them, collaborate with them, y'all. One of the things we did in the men's issue, we co-sponsored the drag show. We co-sponsored Take Back the Night. We put on an event the day before Take Back the Night to help raise awareness and the hype for. We combined our funding with students advocating for sexual safety and empowerment. We made sure that we were showing up for these groups, that we were collaborating with them, that we were taking their ideas, and that was another way we were able to model accountability and humility in our work as men in the way that we show up. So accountability can mean after harm, but you can also show yourself being accountable more proactively too, so that you are an accomplice that does bring on, the folks that you want to work with.
George.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what's been said other than to think about, do we want healing or not? And accountability has to also include this notion that we believe that people have the possibility of healing. And if I don't believe that, then it's not going to be a successful program. So I think one of the beauties, if you will, about how our current program is run is that our facilitator, our coordinator, our lead person in our accountability program believes that these young men, these men who are in batterers programs, that they can be healed, and that there is some trauma that they're working with. And because she's a social worker and because she has that experience, she can work with them to create the change in the community. Is there recidivism? Absolutely. But there is some change, because we have to first believe that men can be healed. And that includes DV and sexual assault programs. Are men welcome in these programs? Are men welcome in the door? How welcoming are we to men who batter in particular around getting them the support that they need? We have to really examine our behaviors around that. That's basically what I wanted to say about that there needs to be a healing that takes place, and that we have to believe that is possible.
Kelly, if I could say something, and I forget what agency came up with this, so I really apologize if they're here and I'm not giving them credit. But sometimes when we look at intersectionality, right, and we look at all the titles of privilege, right, so we can set with a group and we can kind of look at this, right? So we have, racism, we have sexism, we have ableism, we have, all these things, right? And so we can say who's on top, and then we can kind of write down who's in the middle and who's on the bottom in our society as far as power and stature and access to services. And then what we usually do is I will identify whatever group I'm on. So if I'm a woman, I might identify with, okay, men are on top, so that's my interest. Or if I'm a person of color, if I'm a person who's a non-conforming, sexual identity or something like that. And what really is what we need to do is, it's good to have my own cause, but where I really become an ally is in the places where I have power, right? And I'm on top. And we don't ever think about that. When I think about where I'm on bottom, right, this is the one I'm concerned with. And so we really try to get men to engage with and look at where we do have power and how we can become allies with the people who don't have power within that range, while still working on the areas where you're less empowered. But I think that's another way that we can almost be a little bit more strength-based. Here's where you have privilege. Here's where you have power. What are you doing to rise other people up? And what are you doing to really confront that entitlement and that privilege that you have?
Yeah, and I just want to amplify what Jim just said and what Eric just said about stepping in, not from the batterer's perspective accountability, but accountability and showing up in all of the different spaces that we can, and supporting the various different activities that are going on in the community. And thank you for saying that, Eric, because it reminds me that we tend to come from the deficit approach, but let's be proactive and look for ways to engage and be accountable not only to one another, but in terms of our support for other organizations that are doing similar type work.
Thanks. So we got about 3 minutes. I'm going to give, I know it went fast, right? I'm going to give you each about, a closing thought for those on the Zoom meeting. I don't know, Zoom or webinar, I don't know. Zoom meeting, about what you think you want them to take away from this conversation. We'll start with you, Eric.
I guess, for me doing this work, one of the things that really helps me is rooting myself in a lot of these survivor-centered principles we talk about in victim services: the choice, the options, there is no one size fits all. But knowing that there's no one size fits all, it reinforces why I need to know what those options are in my community. So figure out what your options are to engage men. See if there's a collaboration. See if there's a club or an organization like 12 Man or 12 Men Model, or a fraternity, and get some program going. Get the conversation started. And one way you can do it is by appealing to mainstream masculinity. Gamify something. Add sports so there's like a competitive edge that provides jock insurance that then allows men to talk about more soft, mushy stuff. Put on programs that talk about the recent masculinity craze, or masculinity so fragile hashtag, or some recent episode of something that was just on TV. This is something that we did in our men's group a lot. Always, always, always follow up on what's happening in real time. So it's in their face, they get to see what's happening, how it's relevant to them. There's a lot of options, y'all.
Thanks, Eric. George?
There was a great episode of Blackish recently where the father, the son, and the grandfather all talked about how they were not able to communicate. The father was always on the son about he wasn't like the son should be, and the son, who was the father, never got what he needed from his grandfather, from his father. And you could see the generation. First of all, they were Black men. I loved seeing that portrayal of Black men. And also, I loved that they were able to show something on television that we rarely see, where they admitted to, I'm not you and I can't be like you, but I want you to love me for who I am. And you saw that generationally. Those are the conversations that we need to have in real time in our community. If we're facilitating these conversations, we've done it where we've had female identified and male identified facilitators to model what healthy relationships look like, and so I see that as a necessity. And to add to, Eric had a very comprehensive list, but I do think that as male identified individuals, we have to be willing to step into our vulnerabilities and also be allies to women who have been doing this work for many years. And we need to identify what that work is, right? It's not just sitting by and saying, I stand with you. It's getting in the mix. It's doing, it's speaking out. It's making yourself available and not just standing by, never remaining silent, support, or participating in abuse of any kind, and acknowledge the hurt and the harm that you've caused in your own life as male identified individuals in order to be in community. Those are the things I need you to take away from this conversation.
How about you, Jim?
I would just say, you know what, inaction is action, right? So you got to think both what I do and I don't do. Like Eric talked about earlier, that teacher not addressing the use of either queer or gay or whatever that just statement was, sent him a message. So everything that we do sends a message to the victim, to potential victims, to the community, and to the assailant. And so I'm always having to measure, and that well-meaning people with well-meaning policies do devastating things to people around the country every single day. So when I create a policy or I create a practice, I really want to think, what's my accountability and what's the message to everybody, right? And when I collude with him, I tell everybody what he did was okay. I just totally disempowered any potential victims that are in that room and let them know that they're not safe. So really measuring that and thinking about that, I think it's my accountability when I go forward, and realizing that every inaction also it's really a statement. It's an action statement. So I felt honored to be here with such an amazing group, and I appreciate being allowed here. You guys did amazing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. Eric, Jock Insurance, now part of my vocabulary. So thank you for that. Thanks for bringing your voices to the table today. Thanks for taking our invite. And thank you to everybody who sat through this conversation, and hopefully it's not our last. So again, we're just starting the conversations. Thank you all for your work. Thanks so much.